Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for Bennington Historical Society's program. I'm Robert Taggart, Vice President, Program Director of the Bennington Historical Society at the Bennington Museum. These programs are a presentation of the museum and are free and open to the public. So welcome to perhaps one of the last, or the last, virtual meeting. Soon we'll have face-to-face meetings once more. Today we have Tracy Messer, who's going to be Calvin Coolidge for us. In September 1928, President Coolidge delivered an eloquent impromptu speech after touring Vermont by tourists following the devastating floods from the previous year. In honor of its 90th anniversary, the living history performer Tracy Messer produced this original first-person portrayal of the 30th President of the United States to relate to the world how Vermont came to be known as the brave little state of Vermont. Tracy is a living history performer from Peterborough, New Hampshire, and he first portrayed Calvin Coolidge in the spring of 2017. He was born and raised in the Washington area, and his maternal grandfather actually worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture under Coolidge. And his mother, as a little girl, joined the Easter egg hunts that were on the White House lawn. So she probably met Mr. and President and Mrs. Coolidge. Tracy's father was also born in the Boston area and under the governorship of Governor Coolidge. So when Tracy's asked, why do you choose to become a physicist? Tracy replies, I was born to play this role. So there we have it today, and I'll turn it over to Tracy, and we can begin our presentation.
In a quaint New England farmhouse on an early summer's day, a farmer's boy became our chief in a homely, simple way. With neither pomp nor pageantry, he firmly met the task. To keep him on that job of his is all the people ask. So keep cool and keep Coolidge is the slogan of today. Keep cool and keep Coolidge for the good old USA. A lot of politicians cannot do a thing but knock. But Calvin Coolidge is a man of action and not talk. So just keep cool and keep Coolidge in the White House 4 years.
On August 3, 1923, Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States upon the sudden death of his predecessor, Warren G. Harding. His father, Colonel John Coolidge, a notary public and justice of the peace, administered the oath of office at 2:47 a.m. in the sitting room of the family home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Headlines announced the news the following day, and Americans everywhere wondered, who is Calvin Coolidge? He was born on the 4th of July, 1872, and is the only United States president whose birthday is on Independence Day. He began his education in the Vermont public school system and attended Amherst College in Massachusetts, where he studied English, Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. A diplomat once said that Silent Cal could speak 5 languages and be silent in every one of them. After graduation, he read the law with the Northampton, Massachusetts firm of Hammond and Field, and passed the state bar exam in 1897. His 30-year political career began in 1898 as Northampton City Councilman and went on to serve as City Solicitor, City Republican Chairman, and Clerk of the Courts for Hampshire County. He was elected mayor in 1909 and re-elected the following year. Mr. Coolidge was a member of the Massachusetts General Assembly for 2 years prior to his election to the Senate in 1911. There he served as Senate President during his last 2 terms. After 3 years as lieutenant governor, Mr. Coolidge was elected governor in 1918 and again in 1919. While he gained a national reputation as a man of law and order for his role during the Boston police strike, his most significant achievement was consolidating 118 different state departments into just 18. The legacy of the Coolidge presidency from 1923 to 1929 is characterized by his personal attributes of integrity and frugality. Under his leadership, the economy flourished. The national debt declined from $22.3 billion to $16.9 billion. The federal budget was reduced from $5.1 billion to $3.3 billion. By 1927, 98% of the population paid no income tax. His foreign policy favored U.S. participation in the World Court. A war with Mexico was averted, and amicable relations were restored. In 1928, he signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, an international peace treaty in which participating nations promised not to use war to resolve disputes. His civil rights record is largely forgotten. He signed legislation making Native Americans U.S. citizens. He proposed an anti-lynching law and funding for a National Museum of African American History. And he opposed Japanese exclusion in the Immigration Act of 1924. Perhaps his lasting legacy is not his legislative record, but his personal record of leadership with dignity and humility. In his own words, he once observed, "It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man." And now, please welcome our 30th President of the United States, a good man, Calvin Coolidge.
Greetings, my fellow Vermonters. It is a pleasure to be back in the Green Mountain State. Indeed, Vermont is a state I love. It was in September of 1928 when I publicly expressed that statement from the back of a train to a crowd that had gathered in Bennington. I had come to see firsthand the splendid recovery from the devastating floods that had occurred that previous year. To understand my admiration and affection for the people of this brave little state, we need to travel back in time to the year 1927 to review the events that led up to my heartfelt tribute. By 1927, I had already served out the remainder of President Hardin's term in office and was then in the third year of the presidency in my own right. Our nation had returned to a state of normalcy in its transition from the years of the Great War to a time of peace and prosperity. America was now reaching new heights with the marvels of science and technology. We were now in a position to help restore peace and prosperity to other nations throughout the world. At the dawn of the new year, Nicaragua was in the midst of a civil war. Their Congress appointed Adolfo Diaz as the interim leader. At his request for U.S. intervention, I authorized the deployment of 400 Marines. They arrived there in January to monitor upcoming elections and to prevent any other nation from building a Nicaraguan canal. In February, I delivered a speech on the life and legacy of George Washington before both houses of Congress and Supreme Court. Afterwards, I greeted 42 of his descendants who were involved in the planning of the 1932 bicentennial celebration of their ancestors' birth. The aging White House roof was in danger of collapsing and needed to be rebuilt. In March, Mrs. Coolidge and I took up temporary residence at the Patterson Mansion on DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. during the reconstruction. In April, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 struck 700,000 people, becoming the greatest natural disaster in American history up until that time. More than 3 million acres would be flooded. And yet, the federal departments had no funds for disaster relief. There was no precedent for such a large-scale intervention. In response, I appointed the world's greatest engineer, chairman of the relief effort, Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. Drawing upon surplus supplies from the War Department, tents, cots, and blankets, he mobilized the available resources. My feeling was that the role of the executive branch in such situations was to offer coordination, limited supplies, and encouragement. Much of the rest of the money would have to come from the private sector. This was the very sort of test George Washington had warned of, a test of federalism. Times praised this approach, saying,
"Fortunately, there are still some things that can be done without the wisdom of Congress and the all-fathering federal government."
However, not everyone was in agreement. When I resisted calling a special session of Congress to address flood control funding, Senator Thaddeus Caraway of Arkansas spoke up.
"I venture to say that if a similar disaster had affected New England, that the president would have no hesitation in calling an extra session."
Though he had no way of knowing it, his words would soon become prophetic. In the midst of contending with the disastrous Mississippi floods, the nation welcomed some good news in the headlines. In May, Charles Lindbergh made the first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight from New York City to Paris aboard his single-engine aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis. The young aviator became an instant worldwide celebrity. In June, Americans welcomed Lindy home with a ticker-tape parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. On July 4th, 1927, our nation celebrated the 151st anniversary of its birth. I celebrated my 55th birthday that same day. On August 2nd, while vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota, I stunned the nation when I announced to the press, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. No one was more surprised than Mrs. Coolidge. 8 days later, I rode on horseback to deliver a dedication speech at Mount Rushmore. There, I promised national funding for the proposed carving of the presidential figures by sculptor Gutzon Borglum. In September, American inventor Philo Farnsworth demonstrated the first fully functional and complete all-electronic television system. In October, The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, premiered at the Warner Theater in New York City. It was the first feature film originally presented as a talkie and was a major hit. Later that same month, newspapers across America proclaimed a foreboding headline: "A water power battle is at hand." Progressive leaders were seeking complete government ownership of water power across the nation. Ironically, the following week, a torrential rainstorm poured down upon New England. It began on November 3rd and continued non-stop for the next 48 hours. The entire Connecticut River Valley was flooded. My own son, John, who's a student at Amherst College in Massachusetts, saw firsthand how the waters above the Holyoke Dam rose to historic heights. Young women from Smith College performed relief work, including Anne Morrow, future bride of Charles Lindbergh. Vermont bore the worst of the storm. The state was smashed, as the Boston Globe put it, becoming the worst natural disaster in Vermont's history. At least 84 people were killed, including Lieutenant Governor S. Hollister Jackson. He was swept away by the rising waters while trying to escape his flooded car. Property losses throughout the state were staggering, totaling between $30 to $40 million. The American Woolen Company in Winooski estimated damages at $1 million. New England Power also calculated a $1 million loss at Bellows Falls. The Rutland Railway Light and Power was out $300,000. Agricultural surveys reported more than 7,000 acres of farmland were wiped out. 200 barns were destroyed. Over 1,700 cattle and 7,000 chickens were dead, and some 2,500 cords of wood were destroyed. The storm destroyed telephone and telegraph lines as well. The lack of communication only intensified the fears of those who were not able to reach family members and friends. On Sunday, November 6th, Governor John Weeks found his way to a telephone booth and called me to give a personal briefing. Snow now blanketed the icy floodwaters and roadways, hindering recovery efforts. Though the state had not taken federal aid before, it might need it now. Newspaper reports estimated the cost to rebuild the railroads and towns could exceed $10 million. At a November 8th press conference, I described the damage to the road leading to Plymouth Notch. A quarter-mile stretch of the mountains slipped down into the road and cut off travel temporarily between the Union and where I live. From anything I know about the section that was flooded in Vermont, there would be nothing that could be done there about flood control. Vermonters labored for their own recovery. Governor Weeks named Fred Howland, president of the National Life Insurance Company, to manage the disaster. Offers of assistance came in from Governor Al Smith of New York and Governor John Trumbull of Connecticut. At Governor Weeks' request, I again dispatched Secretary Hoover to assess the situation personally. Senator Caraway's challenge had come to life. As one Vermonter explained to a reporter,
President Coolidge can't do for his own, you see, more than he did for the others.
if ever there was a test of living by example, this was it. I remained in Washington, just as I did during the spring flooding of the Mississippi River. Likewise, I again led the Red Cross fundraising relief effort in coordination with United States Senator Porter Dale from Vermont. By Thanksgiving, the Vermont legislature held a special session whereby they voted to raise and appropriate the sum of $8.5 million, half the state budget, for repair work. Additionally, they approved a $300,000 loan to the railroads for reconstruction. That December, I reflected upon the past year's joys and sorrows. It was with a mixture of gratitude and optimism that I issued my holiday greeting to the American people. Christmas is not a time or a season, but a state of mind. To cherish peace and goodwill, to be plenteous in mercy, is to have the real spirit of Christmas. If we think on these things, there will be born in us a Savior, and over us all will shine a star, sending its gleam of hope to the world. The events of 1928 would continue to define the decade as the Roaring Twenties. Month after month, there were advances in science and technology, as well as growing international cooperation. The new year began with a scientific revelation. In January, British bacteriologist Frederick Griffith reported the results of his landmark experiment. Indirectly, he proved the existence of the molecule that contains the genetic code of life, DNA. In February, for the first time in history, the 1928 Winter Olympics were held as a separate event in St. Moritz, Switzerland. In March, I presented aviator Charles Lindbergh with the Medal of Honor for his transatlantic flight. In April, the Republican Party primary elections in Chicago were preceded by violence, bombings, and assassination attempts. The grenade detonations led to this being named the Pineapple Primary. On a much happier note, in May, Disney Studios released an animated short Plain Crazy that featured the first appearances of Mickey and Minnie Mouse in a non-distributed film. In mid-June, aviator Amelia Earhart became the first woman to make a successful transatlantic flight from Newfoundland to Wales. She was a passenger in a Fokker aircraft piloted by Wilma Stoltz. And at the end of June, the 1928 Democratic National Convention took place in Houston. There, New York Governor Al Smith became the first Catholic nominated by a major political party for President of the United States. In July, Scottish inventor John Bayard gave a demonstration in Glasgow of the world's first transmission of color television. On August 27th, United States Secretary of State Frank Kellogg and French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand met in Paris to sign an international treaty whereby participating nations promised not to use war to resolve disputes or conflicts. In September 1928, Scotsman Sir Alexander Fleming noticed a bacteria-killing mold growing in his laboratory, identifying what later became known as penicillin. If only this discovery had occurred just 4 years earlier, it could have averted a personal tragedy. During the summer of 1924, our 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., developed a blister on his toe after playing tennis with his older brother John on the White House lawn. It became infected, and he began to feel ill and ran a fever. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he was gone within a week. When he died, the power and glory of the presidency went with him. Yet, time does not stand still. In September 1928, I returned to Washington, D.C. Having concluded my summer vacation out west, the White House announced plans for a visit to my natal state. In the months and years following the flood, massive reconstruction projects emerged throughout Vermont under the leadership of Governor Weeks. His faith and optimism were captured in the following quote:
Vermont has a future before her that she has not realized. I promise to reconsecrate every ounce of my strength to the work of making Vermont a stronger power in the outside world and a happier place to live in.
The governor's determination was echoed by Ernest Gibson, U.S. Congressman from Vermont, who asserted,
We are undertaking the problem of rehabilitation with courage. We are not faltering. We are filled with the same spirit that actuated our forebears when they entered a trackless wilderness and, with resolution and courage, carved out a state and maintained its independence for years. And we are coming back.
The time was now at hand for me to survey the situation myself. On September 19th, 1928, Mrs. Coolidge and I boarded a train for Vermont. accompanied by Attorney General John Garibaldi Sargent. Before leaving, I issued an appeal of $5 million for the Red Cross to aid victims of a hurricane that swept through Puerto Rico and southern Florida just a few days earlier. The next morning, the presidential train reached Brattleboro. There, we received an enthusiastic welcome that was not dampened by the rain that was spreading north by the storm. The train made a few brief stops, including one at Montpelier Junction, where Governor Weeks and his party came aboard. At Waterbury, the presidential special swept through the station at 40 miles an hour, allowing us only a brief glimpse of the waiting crowd from the platform of the observation car. Mrs. Coolidge and I disembarked at Burlington, where we drove through flag-waving crowds to the Green Mount Cemetery. There, the First Lady laid a wreath on her father's grave. Our party reboarded the train and headed to Middleburg. An estimated crowd of 4,000 had turned out, including students and faculty of the college. As the Legion's drum corps provided music, well-wishers presented Mrs. Coolidge with bouquets. Later that afternoon, we were met with a similar reception in Rutland. The drum and bugle corps made a valiant effort to be heard above the factory whistles and cheering crowd of 3,000 citizens. Finally, the train reached Ludlow, where Mrs. Coolidge and I were then driven 12 miles through the autumn dusk to our old homestead at Plymouth Notch. The following morning, I inspected my farm. 275 acres in the defiant soil of Vermont, as the New York Times described it. The article also noted that I was supplementing my income through the sale of milk to the local cheese factory to the tune of $1.46 a day. I also called on relatives, including my aunt, Sarah Pollard, and my decidedly Democratic cousin, Pat Pollard. It was he who was given the honor of seconding the presidential nomination of New York Governor Al Smith at the Democratic Convention in Houston earlier that summer. I also stopped by the Black River Academy in Ludlow, where I reminisced about my days there as a student. Our party then proceeded to Cavendish, where we spent a half hour examining the chasm left by the flood. Afterwards, we headed back to Rutland, where we boarded the train for a return journey to the nation's capital. The Boston Evening Transcript accurately captured my sentiments.
No returning Vermonter could fail to feel an emotion of pride in traversing her lately ravaged valleys. President Coolidge, deeply loving her every field and stream and forest, must be inspired, on his present return, with inexpressible thoughts.
Late that afternoon, the train made one last stop in Vermont at Bennington. I had resisted earlier calls for me to speak, insisting that I had come only to see the state's recovery. As the bands played, Mrs. Coolidge and I stepped out on the observation car's platform to greet the gathering crowd of some 5,000 people. I was deeply moved and thanked the Vermonters for their kindness and hospitality. At last, my inexpressible thoughts found expression, so that I was now able to make up for my silence. I stepped forward and then spoke from the heart. My fellow Vermonters, for 2 days we have been traveling through this state. We have been up the east side, across, and down the west side. We have seen Brattleboro, Bellows Falls, Windsor, White River Junction, and Bethel. We have looked toward Montpelier. We have visited Burlington and Middlebury. Returning, we have seen Rutland. I have had an opportunity of visiting again the scenes of my childhood. I want to express to you and, through the press, to the other cities of Vermont, my sincere appreciation for the general hospitality bestowed upon me and my associates on the occasion of this journey. It is gratifying to note the splendid recovery from the great catastrophe which overtook the state nearly a year ago. Transportation has been restored. The railroads are in better condition than before. The highways are open to traffic for those who wish to travel by automobile. Vermont is a state I love. I could not look upon the peaks of Ascutney, Killington, Mansfield, and Equinox without being moved in a way that no other scene could move me. It was here that I first saw the light of day. Here I received my bride. Here my dead lie pillowed on the loving breast of our eternal hills. I love Vermont because of her hills and valleys, her scenery, and invigorating climate. But most of all, because of her indomitable people. They are a race of pioneers who have almost beggared themselves to serve others. If the spirit of liberty should vanish in other parts of the Union, and support of our institutions should languish, it could all be replenished from the generous store held by the people of this brave little state of Vermont. I thank you, one and all.
To learn more about Calvin Coolidge and the great floods of 1927, we recommend two books in particular. Coolidge, the most recent biography of our 30th president, written by Amity Shlaes, and The Troubled Roar of the Waters by Deborah Pickman Clifford and Nicholas R. Clifford. Unless otherwise noted, all quotes used in this presentation are taken from these two sources. Almost 100 years after President Coolidge gave his 290-word speech about the brave little state of Vermont, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation is issuing a challenge to middle school students across the state of Vermont. Can you recite Mr. Coolidge's speech from memory? To accept the challenge, memorize the speech and record yourself on video. An adult must attest to your feat. Every student who successfully completes the challenge will receive a special prize and an invitation to participate in a ceremony at the Coolidge Historic Site in Plymouth, Vermont. Entry forms are available at coolidgefoundation.org.
In the spring of 2017, Tracy Messer, a living history performer from Peterborough, New Hampshire, made his very first appearance as Calvin Coolidge. Perhaps the question people ask him most often is, why did you choose to become the next 30th President of the United States? He'll answer with a smile, I was born to play this role. Tracy was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, where his maternal grandfather worked for the United States Department of Agriculture, starting with the Coolidge administration. When his mother was a little girl, she joined in the annual Easter celebrations on the White House lawn, where President and Mrs. Coolidge welcomed the children. Meanwhile, his father was born in Boston right about the time Calvin Coolidge was about to become governor of the state of Massachusetts. In fact, Tracy's great-grandfather once lived in the Coolidge's hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts. Tracy's parents and grandparents had great respect and affection for Calvin Coolidge. His dad and grandfathers shared many of the traditional Yankee characteristics for which our 30th president was so well known. Men of few words who spent their time and money wisely, loyal to their families and communities, honest, hard-working, and polite gentlemen who cherished lifelong education and appreciated the beauty of New England in all its seasons. Tracy and his family admired the view of Mount Ascutney from their old farmhouse in New Hampshire, just like Calvin Coolidge did from his own farmhouse in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Perhaps what Tracy loves most about Mr. Coolidge is his common sense and his sense of humor. Tracy was not the first person to portray Calvin Coolidge. His friend and mentor Jim Cook kept President Coolidge's memory alive and well for 30 years until 2015, when he retired that particular cranky Yankee. With encouragement from Jim, the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and the Coolidge family, Tracy was honored by the invitation to become the next 30th President of the United States. When asked if he was ready for the job, he replied in the words of Calvin Coolidge, "I think I can swing it." To contact Calvin Coolidge living history performer Tracy Messer, visit keepcoolwithcoolidge.net. We'll conclude our program with some questions and comments from the audience. So now, please welcome back Tracy and Mr. Coolidge.
Very nice presentation. Very well done. If anybody has any questions at this point for Tracy, we can take those questions if you want to unmute and ask us.
No, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate folks taking some time out on Father's Day to enjoy this celebration of Vermont. And I hope if you haven't been to the state of Vermont, you'll appreciate why it is a state that I love.
We should also add that if anyone has any questions for President Coolidge, they are also welcome to ask them at this time.
I'd like to know. I'd like to know why the president decided not to run in 1928.
That is a question that has been asked many times, and there are several reasons for that decision. As you know, Mrs. Coolidge and I had lost our youngest son, Calvin, and that had its toll upon the family, and that was part of our decision. Another was that there really was no precedent for any president of the United States serving beyond the term of a previous president and 2 full terms. 10 years was a long time to be president of the United States. And it's a Vermont tradition that once you've filled your role in public service, it's time to either move on or return back to the people. I came from the people, and that's why I wanted to return to them.
So you could, at that time, it wasn't a 2-term presidency. You could go for a 3rd term.
There had not been any limitations of going on for a 3rd term. That is correct. It was really the example that George Washington set after serving his 2 terms that he decided that he was not going on for a 3rd term. And I felt that was a good example to follow.
I guess I'm surprised at why they were surprised that he wasn't going to run, if that was common to do that.
Well, things were going well, and the economy was booming, and I figured most people expected that I would be a shoo-in for the presidency. But I felt the time was to move on and to leave while they still seem to think highly of you.
Thank you.
What would you have done, Mr. President, if you were in office and the stock market crashed? Would you have done anything differently than Mr. Hoover?
That is an excellent question. Certainly, we now know that the lack of regulation is what partly led the market to reach those soaring heights that came to a crash only months after Mr. Hoover took office. And I expect that in every speech that I have given, I have always advocated for personal frugality. It is a personal value of mine, and yet even the President of the United States does not have the authority to impose his own values on the American people. That's a choice they need to make for themselves. So during the Roaring '20s, when people were thinking that the the sky was the limit. People were extending themselves beyond their own means, buying automobiles and appliances and stocks on money that was speculative. So we have to take a look at ourselves as well for who was responsible for that devastating crash.
President Coolidge notch this summer.
How's that?
Will President Coolidge be in Plymouth Notch this summer?
Why, yes, I will be up there over the 4th of July holiday to celebrate my birthday. And then at that point, I'm just going to be loafing a little bit, just rusticating.
And what was the title of the book on the 1927 flood that was referenced in the film?
Yes, again, that is the definitive book on the 1927 floods. I would wholeheartedly recommend that, and would be happy to provide a link to this presentation afterwards for those who would like to review Where the Troubled Waters Roared. Excellent book.
President Coolidge, I would like to know, you came in after a very corrupt administration. Did you have a lot to clean up after President Harding? How difficult was that?
Well, one does not anticipate inheriting a political crisis, but it was my belief that we needed to let the system do its job and let those who had broken the law be held accountable for it. So I had often stated that my role in this endeavor was to simply mind my own business.
Okay.
Thank you.
A question in the chat room. Will the Old Home Day in Plymouth Notch resume in 2022?
Yes, we do hope to have an Old Home Day celebration commemorating the swearing-in ceremony on the 3rd of August of this year. An excellent time for those who haven't been to the Notch to come pay us a visit.
I'm going to put that on my calendar.
When will they celebrate the children's memorizing of the speech?
Yes, the competition is closed for this particular year, but we will have a special acknowledgement over the 4th of July weekend, I believe. And then we'll be encouraging this to be an ongoing endeavor for students to participate in the fall coming to next year.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great production.